Welcome everyone to the Board Leadership Alberta Lunch and Learn online learning sessions. We are going to get started, and we have over 140 people registered for the session today, strengthening board decision-making, the whys, the whats, and the hows. This is wonderful. So good to have so many of you share your lunch hour with us. My name is Scott Vaughn. I'm the host for today's Lunch and Learn session on behalf of Board Leadership Alberta. Working behind the scenes with me, doing tech support, is Shauna Shawtoozy, and she's also with Board Leadership Alberta. Who is Board Leadership Alberta? Well, Board Leadership Alberta is a collaboration of representatives of Board Leadership Lethbridge, Board Leadership Southeast Alberta, and Board Leadership Edmonton. Many of you have probably attended a Board Leadership training event in the past, in Lethbridge, Medicine Hat, and Edmonton, and all of these were coordinated by their Board Leadership committees. They have proven to be very popular and well attended over the past many number of years by many not-for-profit board members and staff in Alberta. Board Leadership Alberta consists of representatives from each of these committees with a shared purpose to provide relevant and accessible online training for representatives of nonprofit organizations across all of Alberta. The Board Leadership Alberta initiative is an extension of the training of each of these committees, working together collaboratively on this specific project, this set of Lunch and Learn sessions. On the slide, you can see a listing of all the organizations that have representatives on each of the board leaderships identified before, as well as they support the Board Leadership Alberta initiative, these Lunch and Learn sessions. We thank each of these organizations for your support of Board Leadership Alberta, the individual board leadership training events in Edmonton, Medicine Hat, and Lethbridge, as well as your support for not-for-profit groups and organizations in your community. Right now, we'd like to take a moment to recognize that we are on the traditional ancestral homeland of many diverse people of Alberta, the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, whose ancestors have walked and stewarded this land since time immemorial. We recognize our role as settlers on this land, and we're grateful to work, live, and learn on this traditional territory. We are located all across Alberta and acknowledge the land of many peoples presently associated with Treaties 6, 7, and 8. This includes the Métis settlements in the 6 regions of the Métis Nation of Alberta. We make this acknowledgement as an act of reconciliation and gratitude. I would like to have you take note of the chat box feature that you have in your Zoom. We'll be placing a number of information links in the chat box. You've already seen the slides and the toolkits and some other resources in there already, but we'll be using that throughout the lunch hour. And the chat box is also placed to ask questions to our speaker today. But please keep in mind that this is a public chat box, so please provide your thoughts and comments with that consideration. Just a note on questions to speakers right now. You can ask a question to the speaker at any time in the chat box. Of note, though, is that our speaker, Jen, will try to respond to all the questions in the Q&A portion of the Lunch and Learn session, which is about 12:50, with about the last 10 minutes of the session. There also will be a chance, if you so choose, to stay online after to ask questions to Jen as well. Because of the short time period we have together today during this lunch hour, she likely won't be answering any questions during her actual presentation. Here is the set of 3 one-hour Lunch and Learn sessions that Board Leadership Alberta is proud to present this fall. As you can see, you're here today for strengthening board decision-making, the whys, the whats, and the hows. The link to register for the next 2 Lunch and Learns you'll see in the chat box right away. Appreciative Policy Making, Policies at Work with David Feldman, and Strategies for Boards Engaging in a Changing Environment with a panel of Jason Opino, Sherry Hansen, and Jennifer Beyer. Registration for all these sessions is free, as you probably noted, coming to this session. And also note that all the Lunch and Learn sessions are going to be recorded and available on the Board Leadership Alberta YouTube channel. The YouTube link is now in the chat box. And as a bonus, you'll see last year's Lunch and Learns webinars there now. And this year's sessions will be added as we go. So I'm now very excited on behalf of our Board Leadership Alberta Committee to introduce the speaker of our first Lunch and Learn session, Strengthening Board Decision-Making, the Whys, the Whats, and the Hows, Jennifer Beyer. Jennifer has spent 2 decades working and volunteering in and with the nonprofit sector at operational governance and systemic levels. She has designed and facilitated majority rules, collaborative and consensus dialogues, and decision-making at organizational, local, provincial, and national levels with nonprofit, public, private, and multi-stakeholder groups. Topics she has worked on ranged from organizational strategic planning to enhancing equity and inclusion in policing forces in Alberta, as well as fighting forces across Canada, to addressing climate change and species at risk in Alberta, and to changing nonprofit funding systems. Jen believes we can tackle the wicked problems we face to transform public policy development and community service delivery, informed by collaborative dialogue that includes everyone, centers marginalized people, and builds true allyship with Indigenous peoples. Jen's interests include social justice and environmental issues, backcountry hiking and paddling, reading, fun and laughter, and spending time with family and friends. So I'm now very pleased to turn it over to a wonderful, knowledgeable presenter, even better person, and good friend, Jennifer Beyer. All yours, Jen.
Thank you, Scott. And thank you for that really kind intro. I'm super happy to be here. I've been doing a lot of thinking lately about consensus, collaboration, and how we talk and make decisions together, both within teams and between teams and organizations and different groups. And so I'm really excited to be talking about this today. It's interesting because as individuals and as groups, we make decisions every day, sometimes without even thinking about it or realizing it's a decision, right? Because what is a decision? It's a series of steps, starting with information collection, including some kind of analysis, and ending with a choice or a resolution. Like everything's a decision. What should I have for breakfast? How should I respond to my partner when they do something like that? How should my partner and I decide what consequences our child should have for something they did? Should I vote in favor of approving this latest financial statement? Some of our decisions we make really, really fast, possibly without even realizing we're going through these steps or making a decision. Or sometimes the choices become so routine that we don't even think about or go through the steps. Still, we make a ton of decisions every day. It's why we hear about decision fatigue these days. I describe it to people as my decision-making muscle is worn out and it needs recovery time. I can't make another decision today. I can't make one more choice. Technically, this decision fatigue is defined as a state of mental overload that negatively impacts a person's ability to continue making decisions. You either can't make them anymore or you're making bad ones. And so it's important to ease decision-making as much as possible in order to keep our decision-making muscle working as well as possible in instances where we need to make decisions. So today we're going to talk about decision-making frameworks. There are several ways to lessen or manage the impact of both individual and group decision-making, or in other words, to not wear out our decision-making muscles so we can continue making positive, healthy decisions. There's also ways to support reliable, consistent, well-considered decisions. Individual routines are one way to do it. So a morning routine, so you never have to decide what to eat for breakfast. But for groups, one way to do this is to have a decision-making framework. So one of my questions for you today, and I'll put it in the chat and invite you to respond, is how do you currently make decisions on your board or within your organization? If you're on multiple boards, maybe think of one. But how do you currently make decisions on your board? Maybe you don't know. Maybe it just kind of happens and you don't think about it. Maybe there is no real approach. Maybe you've never thought about the how of decision making, the process before. Discussion then agreement. Yeah. A lot of nonprofits. Oh, here we go. Okay, so based on mission and values, love that, Lori. We're going to talk about that a little bit. Because the vision, mission, and values of your nonprofit should always be at the heart of every decision throughout the organization. Present the idea, discuss it, then vote. That is very much in line with Robert's rules, motions and votes. So a lot of nonprofits identify Robert's rules as their approach to decision making. In other words, there has to be a motion on the table, and then you vote on that. There are pros and cons to Robert's rules. I will note that I am generally not a fan of Robert's rules. But it is important to note that you don't have to use Robert's rules. There is no rule anywhere that nonprofits have to use Robert's rules as their approach to decision making. It's become, though, a default for a lot of people. Voting, sometimes consensus. We discuss, find info, then agree and move forward. Formal motions with discussions. Gather information, analysis, then decision. Awesome. Oh, Mary, you're going to have a lot to add to this if you have a decision framework that you're using in your meeting. So make sure you add to what I'm saying or ask questions as we go. So all a decision-making framework is the steps for making a decision written down, and then using a decision-making framework requires following, obviously, what you've written down. So decision-making frameworks can be committed to paper in a number of ways. You don't need to be able to read these. These are just visual examples of all the different ways you could capture on paper a decision-making framework. It's important to have one. It's very important to have it down somewhere where people can reference it, because it allows everyone involved to have the same understanding of what goes into a decision, what the steps are, and what needs to happen for a decision to be made. My next question, if you have a decision-making framework or think you have one, do you know where it is? So your bylaws may identify a decision-making process. They may say something like Robert's rules, although I can almost guarantee no nonprofit is following Robert's rules the way they're written. They're 700 pages. It's next to impossible. But you should check your bylaws and your policies, if you have them, to see if you have a decision-making framework already identified or outlined. If it's Robert's in your bylaws, you probably should change it. Not that you shouldn't use the details of it, but the details of it are too many if you don't specify. And if you'd like information on changing your bylaws and policies, I would turn to some of the partners around the table for Board Leadership Alberta. So benefits to a decision-making framework, really quickly, it provides a structure for making decisions. This way, everyone involved can have the same understanding of what goes into a decision, what needs to happen for a decision to be made. It saves time and consideration. You don't have to debate how to make the decision, or did we do all the steps, or should we do this first, or you don't have to decide how to decide every time you have to decide. It also helps with equality when you have that structure, that everyone has the same understanding of what those steps are and what they mean. It helps ensure due consideration is given to whatever issue or whatever problem or whatever alternatives you're choosing between with regards to that. So the best ones help manage bias in the process. They help ensure everyone contributes. They help ensure that all alternatives are put on the table and recognized. And that way, really good due consideration is given in every decision. It also supports values alignment, as someone mentioned in the chat. If you have your framework written down, it helps ensure that your decisions align with your organizational values or principles, including your vision and mission. And finally, it supports evaluation. So decision-making framework can provide a structure for evaluating your decision. Was our choice, how successful was our choice? How many benefits or obstacles did we encounter in implementing that choice? It also can help you evaluate your decision-making process. Does this work? Does it not? Was everyone included? Was everyone considered? Could we do a better job of making decisions in the future? How would we do that? And finally, it provides rationale. I realize my list is out of order. If you go through your decision-making framework, you probably should end up with good rationale for why you chose what you chose, why you made the decision you did, which can help with communicating to funders, to stakeholders, to staff, to the community about the choice you made and the decision you made. When you think about a decision-making framework and why you came today, are there other benefits you hope your board or organization would get if you implemented a decision-making framework? I'm curious if there's things I've missed or haven't considered as benefits of a decision-making framework. I'll invite you to add those to the chat. Maybe something will come to you as we are speaking. Turnaround time, efficiency for sure. If you have a standard process and everyone understands it, it should save you a significant amount of time in decision making. Yeah, Mary, I think that's a good point. For organizational culture, it can not only strengthen and support the kind of organizational culture you want, which we're going to actually talk about a little bit, but it can also be a tool if you're looking to shift organizational culture. A decision-making framework, changes to it, or implementation of one could actually support the organizational culture you want to bring about. Could increase attendance at board meetings. Yeah, less confusion, less unknowns about how things will proceed or how long decisions will take. Ensures all decisions supports mission and plans of service. Yeah, it really encourages and supports values alignment for the organization. I talk a lot to nonprofits about how decisions from all the way through the organization, at the board table, frontline service delivery, all decisions should be made with the vision, mission, and organizational values as key decision-making filters or guides. And so a decision-making framework is really your opportunity to solidify that and make that really clear to everyone. So let's talk about components of a decision-making framework. There are a lot of different frameworks out there. If you Google image search, that was very difficult to say, decision-making frameworks, you're going to see a whole lot of different things. And there are a lot of different ways of implementing the various steps of decision-making frameworks. Based on everything I've seen and read, I would like to suggest that there are 10 components to decision-making frameworks that you should consider when you're building or reviewing yours. So I'm going to invite you to put questions into the chat box as I go through the 10 components. And if you can identify which component you're referring to in your question, that would help me later on with answering as many of those as I can. So what 10 things should you build into any framework? You may not be surprised that the first thing I'm going to say is principles. You need to build in your decision-making principles, and they probably are or align with, and I shouldn't say probably, they should be or align with your organizational vision, mission, and values. So if you have values or it's in your vision and mission around integrity, respect, inclusion, leadership, all of those things that are identified in what are considered your foundational statements for your nonprofit, those definitely need to be a part of this. Decision-making framework principles may include additional things around expectations of behaviors or expectations of approach or values that guide both the decision-making process, so how you move through the steps in your framework, as well as the actual choosing or deciding, which is only really one part of this. So depending on your organization and what you're trying to achieve, anti-racism may be a principle for your decision-making, or social justice. These need to align with your vision, mission, and values for your nonprofit, but they may be in addition to or provide additional detail and guidance to decision-making in particular. Your principles are the basis or the sauce that everything else is in. And so I think they're really core and the first thing you need to consider. If you have examples of other decision-making principles that a nonprofit organization should consider, go ahead and throw those in the chat. Again, the things that come readily to mind for me are integrity, respect, inclusion, leadership, transparency, anti-racism, and social justice. So once you have your decision-making principles, we can talk about the 9 other components to decision-making. So let's start at the top here with identifying the problem or issue. So you need to build this into a decision-making framework. Why? Because if you don't, you may all be trying to solve something slightly different. And if you're all aiming at a slightly different target or have a slightly different perspective on what the problem is, you could run into some real headaches, both with regards to understanding each other as well as with efficiency and time use. So what exactly are you trying to solve or make a decision on? Be really detailed, include the context around it. and make sure that it's a conversation and agreement. You probably want to write it down. So for example, is the issue really that the budget needs approval? Is that really the problem or issue that you're identifying and you need to make a decision on? Or is the problem that your funding has decreased in the last year and you need to decide what programs or services you need to cut back or discontinue in this new financial reality? Or maybe the issue is really that your funding has decreased because you're not achieving the same impact you used to with your programs and services. Maybe you're not getting as many people to your programs, or the people who are coming aren't having the same success or feeling the same impact, and you need to reconsider your program priorities. So even approval of a budget statement may not be the actual problem or issue. It may not really actually be the thing you're deciding about. It may be how you communicate your decision on it, but it's probably not the problem or the issue that you're actually trying to make a decision on. I'm going to invite you to reflect again, and you can reflect for yourself or reflect in the chat, but can you think of some other examples when a board team may need to spend more time being really clear and probably really honest about the problem or issue they're truly trying to solve or make a decision on? Your next step, and this is probably relatively quick, is identification of the decision maker. Who's responsible for making this decision? When you drill down and you get really clear on the problem or issue that you are really trying to resolve and really trying to make a decision on, you may decide that maybe this isn't as clearly a board decision as we thought it was. Maybe you need to give a committee authority to make this choice. Or maybe it really is actually operational and you're realizing we need the executive director or the staff team to really come up with some information and make a decision, or at least suggest a choice and a decision to us. Probably your board will probably for a lot of decisions that are making it to the board table, you will decide that it's a board responsibility. The only caveat I'm going to add on this is that if you're a very small nonprofit and a lot of your board volunteers are also your volunteers for delivering programs and services and are volunteers on the operational side, make sure you're not making the operational decisions at the board meetings. Separate as much as you can the board work on governance from all the other work that happens in the organization. Once you've decided who the decision maker is, the next component for your decision-making framework is how are you going to identify constraints or goals, kind of characteristics of the outcome you want from this decision. An example of this might be that is there a budget your decision has to fit within, or a time frame. Maybe it's something you need to be able to initiate in less than 6 months. Maybe whatever choice you make has to be something that like physically works in a physical space. So there may be constraints like that on the options you can even consider in response to the problem or issue you've identified. And you have to identify constraints, because the $1 million idea for solving this problem would be amazing. But if you only have $1,000, then it's not an option that's going to work for you. Examples of goals that you might want to achieve with making a decision or making a choice would be, when we're considering our options, we really want options that would allow for attendance of 100 to 150 people. Or, when we look at options to resolve this problem or issue, we want to ensure we hear from people we're not yet serving as an organization. Or our goal is really $50,000 in sponsorship. So we need to think about that goal when we're looking at all of our options or all of our alternatives to this problem, issue, this decision we have to make. So you want to somehow in your framework build in identification of constraints and goals that kind of create a frame around possible resolutions, possible choices on this decision. It's only then that you start to move into identifying options and collecting information. Now, I've put these as two separate things because I do think they are separate things, but they're very tightly related. And I don't think they have to happen in a particular order in your framework, but they are still steps to consider. So regarding identification of options, you want to make sure that all possible options for addressing the issue or problem, all possible alternative choices to this decision are identified. What are all the choices you have to choose between when making your decision? And there's often more than the obvious ones. Like when you start to identify options, 3 or 4, maybe 5 will come out right away. They're the obvious ones. But I really challenge you to build your framework in a way that encourages the less obvious ones to be put on the table. So examples of less obvious ones, the really scary or really challenging options or alternatives. So for example, on the budget example I gave earlier, if you're really seeing huge budget or attendance decreases, shutting down your organization is in fact one of your options. Even if you don't want it to be the choice you make, nobody does. And just the idea just gives people shivers and makes them mad. It is still technically one of your options. And so it's important that you say that, you know, just so we're all aware, this is something we could choose. But you also involved in the less obvious options are creative ones. And the reason they're less obvious is that creative options often take some prompting with tools that spark creative thinking or spark seeing connections in new ways between different things. It also takes our brains time to get out of our boxes, to do some work, to actually look for and start digging for those connections. And so creative options might be, what if we merged with another organization? What if we really seriously reconsidered our mission statement and found a new niche that isn't yet being filled, that capitalized on our successes and talents as an organization and still helped achieve our vision? Maybe we look for a shared platform arrangement with another organization. So there's creative options too that you want to make sure you get out on the table that really you need time, space, and probably some prompting tools to help people really make sure all the options are on the table. As David points out, choosing not to choose or delaying your decision is in fact a choice, and I don't recommend it in any situation. So it's worth taking time to find ways to have this step allow for people to say the things no one wants to hear or no one's ever said before, or they're nervous about saying in front of everyone else on the team. This is really also an opportunity for people to ask more and better questions. There's a quote by Tony Robbins, which I shudder a little bit, but there's a quote by Tony Robbins: successful people, and I would say successful teams and organizations, ask better questions. And as a result, they get better answers. So what are the questions you're asking to really prompt, prompt identification of a full range of options? This is closely linked with information collection. So maybe you want to identify options first and then collect information on those options. Maybe you go back and forth between the two. You'll notice that there's an arrow here going back and forth between them. I think you could probably also start with information collection, then move to identification of options. However you choose to move through this in your framework depends on your organization, but information collection is also something to consider in your framework. So how are we going to build in the work of going out, researching and collecting information on our various options or on all the options to help inform our decisions? How do you collect information on how the choices you have may impact diverse members, clients, or staff differently? Because different people with different intersectional identities will face different consequences to these decisions. How much will these various options cost? Have they been tried before and how did they turn out? Has the context changed on how they were tried before and how they turned out? Maybe one way of collecting information may be to put out an RFP, get bids from various potential contractors or consultants. This could also include coming up with more or better questions, right? And so this may end up in additional options being identified. This may be how you want to identify options. But however you do it, you need to be collecting information around the choices you have or the options you face in order to really support decision-making. So then you want to get into, once you've identified your options, you've collected information on them, this is when you start to evaluate the options. So note that this is a separate step. You're not evaluating as you collect information. You're evaluating after you have as much information as you can get. Evaluation of options may be risk assessments, it may be pros and cons lists, benefits and drawbacks conversations. So what are the benefits of each of the options for the organization, for members with various identities, for clients with various identities and experiences? What are the drawbacks to each of those groups as well? Are there risks with these options? How can those risks be mitigated? Can those risks be mitigated? How easy is the mitigation to implement? And how do they compare with each other in terms of how many resources they may require, both human and financial, or how long they may take to implement, or how long it may be before you see the benefits and the positive consequences of those choices. So this is when you get into evaluation of options. It's only then that you actually get to the decision-making part of your decision-making framework. You actually make a choice. So you choose between the options and you determine how to proceed. This may be consensus, so everyone agrees on how to proceed. This may be a Robert's Rules kind of approach. There's a motion and a vote. There's a whole bunch of different ways to actually make the choice. But this is where you actually determine which option to go with. You'll notice it's the eighth component in 10 components I think there are in decision making. And so it's curious to me how quickly I think we move through a lot of the other steps to get to the choosing part of decision making. The last two steps obviously are implementation and evaluation. So implementing the decision is the work of carrying out the choice. It's the work of implementing the choice. So depending on the issue you are making the decision about, there could be a lot of work to implement it. Who needs to be communicated with about the choice? Is there an order they need to be communicated with in? Is there a time frame? Like we need to let everyone know by X date. Are there changes that need to be made to budgets? Are there things that need to be purchased or sold or resolved? Do contracts need to be drawn up? There's probably a whole bunch of tasks for implementing this choice or this decision. Depending on the issue, depending on the choice made, all of the work, some of the work, or none of the work of implementation may fall to the board. And so it's important that those who are doing the implementing have the most authority to determine the tasks and timelines for implementing the choice, with the caveat that, of course, that the board may still want to set high-level deadlines or high-level timelines. They may still want to see the plan within a certain time frame to review it and keep themselves up to date. That's something for the board to determine. And then finally, evaluation. Very few individuals or teams do this. We very rarely evaluate how well did the choice hold up. Did it meet our expectations? Did we see the benefits we expected to? Were there lessons learned? What outcomes were met or not met? Were there unintended consequences that we didn't anticipate because they were unintended? So you want to learn for future similar decisions. And so it's really important that you look at and evaluate that choice. Probably timeline for it will depend on the nature of the problem, issue, and choice, but you want to make sure you evaluate in some way. This step also involves self-evaluating the process and your movement through it. Did the steps in your decision-making framework work for your board? Did everyone understand their role and responsibilities in moving through this? Maybe your framework is too complex and you need to make it simpler. Or maybe there wasn't as much detail as would have been helpful and you can now add detail to make it a quicker and more seamless process in the future. This evaluating decision step is really critical to improving your decision-making over time. I want to highlight again that there are a number of different ways of carrying out each of these steps. There are myriad different questions to ask or tools to use depending on the approach you're taking and what works for your organization. What's important here is that your organization figures out a framework that aligns with your organizational vision, mission, and values, and that works for your unique organizational culture, moving through these 9 steps and considering decision-making principles. So, quick question to you, because that felt like a lot of information. Which of these 10 components was the biggest surprise for you, or something you hadn't considered as part of a decision-making framework before? I'll even put the components in the chat to hopefully make for a quick copy and paste if anyone wants to use that. Which of these was the biggest surprise for you? Getting all choices clear and outlined is very big, yes. And I think all choices is a critical point there, Mary, that again, we tend to look at the simple options or the obvious options or the ones that are most, I want to say the most palatable, the ones we like the most, you know, that cause the least disruption or, you know, will be least challenged by others. But it's really important we get all these choices on the table so we have that full picture. Yeah, making the decision so late in the process is usually a big surprise for people. Identifying the decision maker, yeah, especially, and I think identifying the decision maker comes after identifying the problem or issue, because when you really drill down to the root and what you're actually trying to solve, you may realize that, you know, in fact, this isn't the board's decision. You may not, I mean, but you may. Yeah, Wayne's just asking quickly in the chat, can you expect that a given framework is accepted by incoming board members? We're going to talk about where you write it down, but yes, when new individuals join your board, they're usually expected to understand and abide by the bylaws and policies of your organization. And your decision-making framework is probably written down in both of those places, but I'm going to get into detail about what. Don't put the whole framework in your bylaws. I just gave it away, but we will talk about that. But yes, they should be expected to take that, to take on and work through this process. Now, there's no one size fits all, obviously, when it comes to decision-making frameworks. Like I said, if you Google it, you're going to find a ton of options for this. You may want to start with one that, like, when you look at it, you're like, this looks good. This is a very good broad outline. We can just fill in the details for our organization or make a couple tweaks to it. That's fine. Try some decision-making frameworks on. See how they fit for your board and your organization. That is an okay way to do this. I do think when you're designing your framework, there are some considerations. There's some things you should really think about when you're either choosing or probably building, maybe not from scratch, maybe you're building off of someone else's idea, but when you're choosing or building a decision-making framework. The first is conflict. So decision-making frameworks are fantastic tools for conflict, or when there's high conflict about either the problem or issue or around the potential options that you have to choose between for that problem or issue. Given how polarized opinions and perspectives are these days on like a wide variety of issues and topics, it's highly likely that even if you haven't experienced high conflict yet, you probably will at some point in the future, either on your board or between your board and the people who are impacted by the decision or something like that. Decision-making frameworks are really helpful for that because they lay out, here's how we worked through it, here's our rationale for it. You know, you may not like it, but we had a good process and a good way of making the choice. It takes the guesswork out of how to make the decision. It takes the guesswork out of how you're going to make the choice and what goes into before you ever make the choice. It also takes arguments out of how to proceed with sensitive or challenging issues. So a lot of people, when they're experiencing conflict around an issue, will start to argue about the process. Well, why are we doing it this way? If this is the issue, we really should be talking about that. You remove all of that from the conflict when the process is already laid out. You follow the framework. Why are we doing that like this? We're following the framework. I think we should be doing it this way. This is our framework, and this is what we'll follow for now. We can always make tweaks to the framework later. Having said that, the best time to make the framework is when you are not in conflict. It's when you can all think strategically and creatively together, and you can have really good dialogue about the framework in really respectful and honest ways. Make the framework now so that you have it as a tool for when you run into conflict. The other thing about conflict that you want to consider when you're building a decision-making framework is what conflict has your organization or board run into in the past? What clarity would have been helpful at that time? Where did you run into disagreements on how to proceed? When did you just not know what to do next? Consider all of those things and add solutions to that to the decision-making framework that you build. You also want to possibly imagine future conflict. What if in the future the board was really divided on an issue? What would we do in that situation? How would we like to see the board uphold the vision, mission, and values and work together as a team resolving that? What steps or guidance would be helpful to a group going through that? And always considering your vision, mission, and values. Imagine those really difficult things you could run into in the future and how a framework would help lessen the conflict and really focus it on the issue or problem to be solved. So, because sometimes we have trouble thinking about this, I will encourage you to put in the chat some conflicts your board has run into in the past, or that you imagine you may run into in the future, that a decision-making framework could be a tool to help you work through. What are some of those conflicts that you can imagine your board running into, or your board has run into? Second consideration is people. I wish people were simple sometimes, although life would be way less interesting. People are complex. We've got emotions, we've got histories, we've got experiences. They can all, in various combinations, having us show up to board meetings exhausted, happy, grumpy, hopeful, worn out, ready for an argument because we just lost the last one we had with our partner, or anything. And all of that influences how we are able to show up to the conversation and to the decision. It all influences how open we are to working with other people, to hearing other people, to really considering alternate viewpoints. And because we've all got intersectional identities, it also means we all bring different perspectives and values to these conversations, no matter how we're showing up. So we bring different approaches to decision-making based on how we were raised in our families or based on our culture. We all have learned behaviors of how conflict is or has been resolved in the past. We're also all riddled, whether we like it or not, we are full of biases and assumptions, both conscious and unconscious, that make it really difficult to make reasonable, thoughtful, and especially equitable choices. So when you're building your framework, you really want to think about people. And you need to consider, how do you remove emotion from the situation? If you can, you'll never remove it completely, but can you try and remove emotion a little bit, or make space for emotion to be expressed and then to move to the next step? How do you manage biases? Confirmation bias and availability bias are big ones. Unconscious racial and gender biases, which we all have, myself included, all influence our decision-making. So how do you manage those biases so that they influence your decision-making a little bit less than they tend to do now, so that your board is supported making better decisions? Third consideration is diversity, equity, and inclusion. Some people are adding accessibility to this and making it DEIA. Social justice is also related to this, an important part, but there's three pieces to this. One is engaging and hearing from diverse clients, members, stakeholders to inform board decision-making. So basically DEI in information collection and option development. Most nonprofit boards at this point do not reflect the people they serve or the diversity of people they could be serving, which means you are missing intersectional experience and perspective in your decision-making. So for example, how many food banks have someone who relies or has relied on a food bank on their board, helping make those board decisions? How many homeless serving organizations are representative of the demographics of the homeless population in their community? How many sports associations reflect the demographics of the city or town they serve? I can tell you right now, the answer is not many. There are surveys, national and provincial, that show that our boards do not reflect the diversity of our community. That means it is critical that DEI is considered in your option development and information collection, because you need information, context, and insight from diverse current and potential future clients, members, and stakeholders. You have to find ways to engage those people in conversation to inform and evaluate your board decision-making, at least until their intersectional identities and experiences are represented on your board. Until they are sitting on your board, we don't know. I can't know what it is for people with different identities than me I can't know or understand their nuances, their considerations, the consequences for them of decisions until I hear from them. You also want to build DEI onto your board team, obviously. So your framework needs to consider the diverse people currently on your board, as well as the hopeful future diversity of your board. And how can you ensure that diverse individuals on your board are equitably included in the whole decision-making process? How are their voices heard and integrated? How are their diverse approaches to decision-making respected and considered and included as practice in your decision-making? The third place to consider DEI when you're building your decision-making framework is when you're actually making decisions. So are you making your decisions and your choices through a social justice or DEI lens? Is inclusion and access for diverse people a core principle of your decision-making? Current systems, policies, rules, laws, organizational structures, relationships are designed for those who have typically and continue to hold the majority of power. Our systems work really, really well for them. But nonprofits, all organizations and all sectors, but we're talking nonprofits today, need to start dismantling those systems and building new ones. So if your organization has any kind of social focus, and I wasn't able to think of a single public-based nonprofit that wouldn't. Sports organizations, arts organizations, social service organizations, all have a social focus, a community focus. Then in order to actually live your vision, mission, and values, you need to be building DEI into your decision-making principles and into how you make your actual choice. So another question for you is, what questions or curiosities do you have about building DEI into your organization, especially into your decision-making framework? Your final consideration, writing it down. So someone mentioned this earlier. Do new board members have to accept this? Yes, because they have to accept your bylaws and policies, at least to start. You may decide to make changes to them, but at least to start when they join. So once you're pretty comfortable with what you've designed, take a step back, figure out what the fundamental pieces are that should be difficult to change to ensure integrity of the principles, at least of the framework, or the high level of the framework. You might want to consider putting those in your bylaws, which means you have to draft the bylaw, get it passed at an AGM, file it with registries, etc. The vast majority of your framework, though, should be put in your policies so that it can be tweaked as things are learned, as your understanding evolves, as your organization evolves, etc. I realize I'm running low on time. I always do. I apologize. I want to quickly run through some examples of decision-making frameworks. So Robert's Rules is one that a lot of people use. It breaks every decision into a yes/no, because every decision has to be a motion that's debated and you either vote in favor or against it or abstain. Very simple. That's a benefit. Technically in Robert's Rules, they try and make sure everyone has equal rights, equal opportunity to be heard, equal opportunity to decide how they want to engage, exercise those rights. Those are benefits. Drawbacks, the latest version is 700 pages. I can almost guarantee if you have Robert's Rules in your bylaws, you're not actually following it. And if Robert showed up, you'd be in big trouble. And parliamentary procedures like this is about equality, but it is not about equity and accommodations. So Robert's Rules is not good for DEI. For example, Robert's Rules require that you have to stand up to be recognized to speak. What if you're in a wheelchair? What if you can't stand up? They're not equitable. So pros and cons to Robert's rules. Pros to consensus model. You should be able to guarantee that no one involved in the decision is really going to fight against it if you take a consensus approach to your decision-making framework, because the decision is and everyone can live with this choice or decision-making. It's also a little bit stronger decision-making. It creates some space for diversity in decision-making. And so there's real benefits to consensus models. Drawbacks to true consensus models, they don't work if there are distinct sides usually. So if there's like a right or wrong in the situation, or there's really like two sides in a debate, consensus models don't really work well. The other challenge is they take time, particularly if the challenge is complex, although, I mean, it's a drawback, but I would argue it's probably also a strength in complex situations. Benefits to true collaborative models. They involve not just hearing, but really appreciating other points of view. So dissent isn't suppressed. Diverse opinions are encouraged. You're usually building something new. So this is super helpful for complex challenges. You're more likely to get more creative and probably more effective solutions. Collaborative models also generally create high levels of buy-in because everyone likely sees them, a piece of themselves in the end product. So you should get full support, agreement, and high levels of buy-in at the end. Drawbacks, again, collaborative models take time. If you need to make a decision quickly or the problem is simple, this process is too time-consuming, collaborative processes. The other drawback to this, is inclusion challenges have to be addressed through proper equity and accommodation tactics, or you're not really undertaking a true collaborative approach to your decision-making. And those accommodations take time and resources to do well. So in closing, what are your next steps? Check your bylaws and your policies, see if they identify a framework. If they do, great. If they don't, good to know. Bring that framework and whatever you find to your board, get buy-in. Tell them, I found something I didn't. Are we interested in setting one up that works for us? Get the board's interest and support for building a framework. And these may seem like really small next steps for you, but they are actually huge and the necessary next steps. And then finally, your third step is agree on how the work should be done. Do you delegate a committee? Do you delegate a single person? Do you have the whole board work through it together? There's a whole bunch of different ways you can set yourself up for how to get the work done. Once you've got your work team set up, then the work of actually building the framework begins. So with that, I'm a little bit over time. I apologize, but I will stop sharing screen here and open things up to questions. And I think I'm going to Scott.
Yes.
That.
Yeah. Thank you, Jen. Yes, it is Q&A time, question and answer time for Jen. So put your question for Jen over the next few minutes. If you have a question from the presentation for Jen, and I even have a question for you till the first questions come up, Jen.
Okay.
What is a message do you have for boards that don't have any decision-making framework at all? Maybe they just have historically have done it through each set of board members that have been there each year, or maybe the chair has been the leader on how the decisions were made. It gets done, but there's really nowhere is there a decision-making framework or opportunity where people have got together. How should we best make decisions in our organization? What is a message you might pass on to those organizations?
Muted myself so you wouldn't hear me slurping water, and then I forgot to unmute. Here's where I think I would start. Is my suggestion would be to have it be an agenda item at your next board meeting to talk about some of the benefits of a framework now and in the future. So potentially, if we ran into conflict, this would help. It would help our decisions align with our organizational vision, mission, and values consistently, etc. I would get buy-in from the board to looking at a decision-making framework and really considering how to write one down for the organization. And so that's where I would start, is I would get buy-in just for having the conversation and doing the work of considering a board decision-making framework and what that might look like. I guess here's the other thing. So in the pause, my brain keeps working. Here's the other thing I would suggest, is that for a lot of us, because our boards aren't representative of the populations we serve, because anti-racism and social justice are increasingly important expectations that people are having in their communities of the organizations they work with or attend, I think that requires boards now to be more clear in their decision-making frameworks and to have ones where they didn't need one in the past. So that ability to be transparent, to communicate, and to demonstrate that you are doing your best to live and decide by those values as a board and as an organization is going to be increasingly critical. So if you haven't had a decision-making framework in the past, now is the time, before you're under intense pressure to have one and you're trying to catch up, to make a framework that works for your organization.
Yeah, folks, keep your questions, put them in the chat box. So you're saying definitely you might have got away with it in the past, but things in the world that we're in now, the types of decisions that have to be made, you know, the diversity, inclusion, all those parts that you mentioned in your presentation, that more than ever you need to go that direction, even though you may not have had to have it in the past. Fair to say?
That's exactly what I'm saying, Scott. I think that as well. So yes, and as we're talking about this, I get to thinking too about the fact that the decisions we've made haven't worked for everyone in the past, and that's one of the reasons we're realizing how important anti-racism lenses are, how important truth and reconciliation is. For governments, yes, but also for nonprofits, also for communities, cities and towns, neighborhoods, demographic communities even, where the truth of the different experiences different people have is really becoming known to us in a way I don't think most of us, especially people with privilege and power, realized or appreciated before. And so that means decision-making is also increasingly complex, even the simple ones, because how are we considering those diverse intersectional identities and how our decisions will be experienced differently by each of them? So where even where a decision may have seemed simple in the past, I don't know that it is anymore. And the more complicated or complex a decision is, the more a decision-making framework will help you ensure that you are really considering all of the options, you're considering all of the benefits and drawbacks of those options, including impacts on various people, and you can stand behind your decision in a really meaningful and genuine way.
Okay. This is another question, one of the questions I see in the chat box. How do you attract the D&I people to your board who don't have to come out of the closet or out of the box, if you will? What are some thoughts that how you might even strategies there? Challenging question, but any thoughts there on that one?
Yeah, so I'm assuming I'm understanding the question to mean, how do you attract diverse people to your board? I'll take that part of the question first. And I think the critical part, I think for me, there's two pieces in that. One is communicating to them that there is space on your board for them and that they provide value to your board. I know this sounds silly. I work with and for the nonprofit sector. I'm a volunteer in the nonprofit sector. How do I find which boards are looking for people? And I have a lot of privilege and power. And I don't know how to find these boards. Like literally, and I'm not saying this to all of you right now. I'm not looking for this many board positions, but I can't Google nonprofit boards looking for directors. I don't know how to find these boards, which means how are people recruiting? Can almost guarantee that we're not putting out that communication in spaces where people who aren't us are going to look for that kind of information or would stumble upon that information. So an all-important first step to getting a more diverse group of people on your board is letting people different than you know that there are openings on the board, and that means finding out where they gather, how they communicate, when they communicate, etc. I remember saying to groups, this is pre-COVID, but I remember saying to groups that I had a great uncle in a small town here in Alberta. If you wanted to communicate with him, the best way to reach him was a poster at the A&W, because he went there for coffee Monday through Friday with his friends. You don't post on Facebook to get my Uncle Bud. You don't post on Facebook to get me anymore, let's be honest. So where do you go to communicate with different people would be my first thing about how do you attract them. The second thing I think is a visible commitment to practicing inclusion of diverse people, acknowledging you're going to make mistakes, acknowledging that there may be a lot for a lot of people to learn, but making that commitment that you are open and willing to learn to how to do inclusion better, and making that commitment to them, and then supporting them and encouraging them to call out when you're not living up to that commitment.
Thank you, Jen. You know, it's the end of our time for questions now. I guess a lot of people said good points, such as some of those questions you answered right there, Jen. So obviously you're hitting a chord with people and some key messaging there. We do need to move toward the closing of this Lunch and Learn now. Good news is that Jen has agreed to stay with us online for up to 15 minutes after this Lunch and Learn session is over to answer any of your questions we didn't get to in the Q&A. So here's how we're going to do it. I'm going to formally close the session with a few final thoughts in the next couple of minutes, along with a goodbye. After we said our formal goodbye and you have a question for Jen, just simply stay online. We'll let everybody leave, and then we'll see who's left, and then we'll try to get all your questions from you. So we're going to take this to approximately 1:15 or so at the end time for that even too. So it's your choice whether you want to stay online after or not. So on behalf of Board Leadership Alberta and all the participants today, I would really like to say thank you, Jen, so much for sharing with us your insights, your key learnings, ideas we need to keep in mind in our organizations in the development and execution of nonprofit board decision making. Every time I listen and we have conversations, I really learn a lot. And again, I'm sure from what I'm seeing everybody in the chat box, they learned as well. So that was great. Thank you. You gave us a ton of information that'll be very, very, very valuable. Once again, thank you so much, Jen, for taking the time to be with us as part of this Lunch and Learn series. I'd also like to if everybody you could complete in the chat box. If you don't have time to do it right now, you can do it later, but if you can do it right now, that would be great. It's just a simple one-page evaluation form. You're going to see it in the chat box here right away, that evaluation form. You can get it in there right now. There it is. And we'll make sure that get it. There we go. So you can see that in the chat box is the evaluation form. It's just a one-pager. You can complete it. Really good information for future Board Leadership Alberta Lunch and Learns on some of the session topic areas that you're looking for. So please fill that out if you can, and also in your experience today with the session. And doesn't end today. We have 2 more Lunch and Learn sessions. The link to register for the next 2 Lunch and Learns you're going to see in there as well, and you can see they're coming up. Appreciative policy making, policies that work, and also strategies for boards engaging in a changing environment. And you can see the link to register for those sessions are there as well. And I also want to give a shout out to upcoming Board Leadership Calgary online learning sessions coming up in November. On the screen, you can see the dates for the upcoming sessions, and we're also going to put a link where you can find out more information, keep on track of Board Leadership Calgary information coming up, and you can see the tentative topic areas and how to register when the registration opens. You'll see all of that on the screen, but also click on the link and you'll be able to get the information for the Board Leadership Calgary sessions coming up as well. So I want to say thank you for attending today's session. Make sure that the toolkit resources, I think even some of the information that Jen provided, you'll see even more details on some of the resources that she provided for the toolkit. And we also put together some information from Board Leadership Alberta for the toolkit. So take a look at that to even even some more information, more detailed information about the whole topic today about whole board decision making. So take a look at that. Highly recommend it. So on behalf of Board Leadership Alberta, thank you everyone for taking the time to be with us this Lunch and Learn hour, our first Lunch and Learn session this fall. Make sure to come back next week, September 29th, for the second of the 3 sessions. Get appreciative policy making, policy that work with David Feldman of Edmonton Chamber of Volunteer Organizations. Looking forward to that session as well. In the meantime, take care, stay healthy, and have a great rest of your day and week. And goodbye, and hope you're able to join us again next Thursday. And for those of you that still have a question for Jen, simply stay online. In a couple of minutes. We'll have an informal Q&A for about 10 minutes or so after that. So this is the formal goodbye for those that need to go now. And again, for those that do want to stay, have a question or two more for Jen, simply stay online. Okay, everybody do that for a minute or so right now.
I'm just scrolling through the chat in case there are some questions I missed, and I can start with those. I guess we can also open it up if anyone wants to unmute and ask questions. Is that right, Scott?
Yeah, absolutely. If anybody has a question, just either 2 ways, either whether you want to ask the question right in the chat box, or if you'd like to be unmuted, just let us know. Either way is perfectly fine. We do see a few people that are still here. Just put maybe your hand up, or put a 1 in the chat box if you're would like to say your question verbally.
Okay, I see one in the chat. Have you had experiences with merging frameworks between organizations? So Jennifer, my answer to you is, you're not going to like this. It depends. I will say most organizations don't have their decision-making frameworks written down. They're assumed. They're something people are kind of expected to pick up when they join the board, except existing board members don't even realize they have that expectation for new members. So whenever you're trying to merge groups together, merging decision-making is definitely a part of that. But it doesn't mean it's always merging two written down frameworks that you can discuss as tangible things. It's more often around merging cultures or merging approaches and writing down the end results that then they have something to refer back to. Does that kind of answer your question? Maybe the other thing I'll caveat, I need to learn how to pronounce that word on this is, I don't know about merging frameworks. Sometimes I wonder if a collaborative approach should be taken, and one framework is a set of information, the other framework is a set of information, the goals of the merger are another set of information, and actually going through a decision-making process for a decision-making framework for these merged organizations.
Actually, that's a good point.
Oh, go ahead.
Like maybe it's more about realigning with the new objectives, or kind of the new vision of that organization as they do merge, because it's not necessarily like a brute force merger of the decision framework, but kind of picking what makes sense and aligns with it.
Yeah, exactly. And it could be picking pieces, like someone may say, you know, when we think about this, our organization's done this this in the past, and here's how it worked really well. What do you think? Oh, well, we would do that, but we would include this piece. Oh, that makes a lot of sense. That makes it even stronger. Let's have it work like that in our decision-making framework. So I would make it more of a dialogue and more of a collaborative building process, I think.
Thank you. Thanks, Jen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no problem. Great first name, by the way.
Other questions for Jen? Either you put them in the chat box or ask to be unmuted. Lots of people online. Is
I
anybody,
know.
is everybody's luck? Listen, feel free to ask a question. And I can perfectly understand people wanting to even just listen. That's perfectly fine. But just this is your moment if you do want to have a question with Jen.
Well, maybe as we wait for someone to unmute or write in the chat box, I'll mention efficiency came up a lot.
Yeah.
I really do. So I encourage nonprofits that I work with that their board should have vision, mission, and organizational values literally written down in front of them at every meeting. So now meetings are online. So, I mean, have them at the top of the agenda. So you literally have to look at them at every meeting because hopefully you're reading and following your agenda. But they should be on every agenda and informing every decision. When you build a decision-making framework and write it down, that should probably be not just part of your agenda, it's considered in your agenda design, but also included in your agenda package. There is nothing wrong with sharing that same thing over and over and over again and having it be very readily available to support your process through your board meeting of making decisions. So yeah, so have it be, you might have a lot of detail in your policy, but have something that's like a one-pager that you can attach to agendas that can remind people or spark thinking, hey, you know, I really feel like we're skipping over this step and this step is an important part of our framework. Can we just pause here and go back and really make sure you're following that framework all the time? It will save you a lot of time, especially as you get practiced at using it. It should make decision-making much more efficient.
So I'm waiting for another question. Oh, would you consider giving, this came from Chantel, would you consider giving a full session on strategies for targeting or attracting DEI members to your board?
Would I, I mean, yes, honestly, I would want to, so yes, I would consider that. I mean, I would share that with Board Leadership Alberta. They have a diverse group of partners from across the province who probably also have some great ideas and some great connections for that. So as a white person sitting here, woman, but all the other privileges almost, I would say that who you want to hear from for strategies for attracting and retaining, which I think is really critical, diverse members to your board, is you want to hear from boards who have successfully done it, probably, or from those diverse intersectional identities that aren't usually recruited to boards. And so I think a full session of ideas from someone with privilege and power is one thing, but I would think that the most helpful session would be one that included those diverse identities. So, I mean, the short answer to your question is yes, Chantel. I probably would either not want to do it myself or make sure that there was a lot. Yeah, I wouldn't want to do it myself. Sorry.
Certainly mention it, Chantel, as a topic for next year in the evaluation form, because that might be your, or even sooner, even Board Leadership Calgary's listening in too. They might, I know they've did some things in that area as well already. So yeah, I'll get another one. From Jennifer, have you witnessed an increase in ESG considerations, you know, the particularly environmental considerations being integrated into decision-making frameworks where not seen traditionally? Any examples? Yeah.
Not really outside of environmental focused organizations who are obviously considering it and have hopefully been living those values and role modeling those values for a very long time. But no, I will say that the UN Social Development Goals, I think, are increasingly being considered as part of organizational values and decision making. And I recently found a group, it's all volunteer, that are developing internal or individual development goals and looking at the individual development we need to do to be able to participate in a way that aligns with the values and the approaches and the thinking that are necessary to really truly act on and act towards the social development goals. both, I mean, I think are super cool. But no, I haven't seen yet any organizations integrating them in really tangible, successful ways. If I do, I will make sure I share those. But yeah.
David Feldman, our speaker next week from Edmonton Chamber of Volunteer Organization, is mentioning the Africa Center in Edmonton has an emerging leader program that places people on boards.
Yeah. Yeah, yes, and you know, the other place to look for board opportunities is out of Calgary, Volunteer Connector. I'm not on it a lot. It's probably, I don't know that it's successfully inclusive of diverse organizations and recruitment of diverse people, but it is one other place to consider and check. Jennifer, really good question. The other thing I'll say is something that I'm interested in working with organizations on. So I have there are conversations happening around how do we integrate social justice? How do we integrate anti-racism? How do we integrate environmental and social justice into any organization that is interested in anything related to that? Because if we're not living those values and demonstrating those values as a board in our interactions with each other and in our decisions, then we have work to do to better lead our organization trying to achieve the vision it has. So a conversation I'm interested in continuing and working with groups on.
A couple questions. I see a couple hands up in the participant list. Hawks Landing, I just see a hand up there. Hawks Landing, you're on. Question for Jen?
Yes, I do. Jennifer, this is Rita Burtwell. We've spoken before. It's great to put a face to the voice now. I just have a comment and also just an idea.
Cool.
I just want to say, okay, so I just want to say very valuable information. Excellent, seminar here. And would the government or any organization consider making these seminars mandatory for board members, for people that want to be on a board? Seriously, because people don't tend to understand why they're on a board, especially community associations. And this is very valuable. And so would that be wonderful if we could make something like this mandatory so that people that do join a board understand what they're there for?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll start with an answer, and then I'm going to open it up to Scott and David Feldman and anyone else who wants to jump in. But can we make it mandatory? At this point, no. There is no law that says thou shalt have taken this training or do this thing or whatever in order to be on a board. Now, from a DEI perspective, that's a good thing, because anything we build could or would have built in the past would probably very likely not be anti-racist, not be socially just, and probably filter out people for not fair reasons. So from a DEI perspective, it's probably a good thing we haven't had it. From a, hey, it's helpful for people to have a base understanding of what nonprofit boards are, what governance means, etc. Yes, but there is no law at this point that requires it, and beyond a law, it's up to individual organizations as a part of bringing new board members on and supporting them having positive experiences and contributing in really meaningful and successful ways to the boards. It's up to boards to support their members with that. And so to either have money for training or to have information on available training, or I know in the past I've encouraged, many people encourage boards to go through training together. But yeah, no, in answer to your question, there is no way. And will there be a way? Very likely not any provincial wide mandatory thing that people would have to go through. But that's my perspective. So Scott and David, I would ask you what your thoughts are.
Well, I'd have to concur. I'll turn it over to David here too, both to answer this question, but also to ask his question. But I'll just say a couple words first. I think it'd be very tough to make mandatory. I'm with Community Development Unit, Alberta Culture, Status of Women. I think it just would not work well. I think there's some other challenges that might come in. But one thing that has happened, I think over the last 10, 15 years is that there's been a lot more emphasis on accessibility to training. We have a BDP webinar series, board development program, with a number of sessions online. A lot of people do attend, and just to get some basics on understanding, you know, what it means to be a board member, making them more accessible so people can easily access both the webinars, but also the resources, the information. I also know that David and Edmund Chamber of Volunteer Organizations are also working in the sector for the capacity building as well. And I know there's many others in the province of Alberta that's trying to make the information more accessible, easy, just sessions like this even, so that the importance of it is right there in front of as many people as we can. So it's probably the best way that it can answer that at this point. But I am going to turn it over to David. If you could maybe, if you want to provide some thoughts both to that question and even your other question you probably had for Jen as well.
Asking me that question is a dangerous one. And let me know if you can't hear me well, because I didn't test my mic. I wasn't expecting to be speaking today.
We can hear you, David.
You're coming in clear, yeah.
I think I'd add a few things. One is, when it comes to mandatory training and professional development for a profession, I think it's really dangerous for a government body to be doing it versus a governing body to be doing it. And so where that is coming from is really important. Because the nonprofit sector, like the social sector, was really designed to be responsive and to be driven by the people, and who makes that mandatory training shapes how they think and how they act and how they make decisions and what equity and diversity looks like on those boards. So would I love to see mandatory board training? Yes. Who should do it and how and which one? I think that's a really dangerous question. But I would encourage people on their boards to create, to find training programs that work, that you think matches the type of governance that you want to have, and instead make that mandatory as part of joining the board. I think we often have this thing of, I got voted on at the AGM, I'm now a board member. And then, I'm seeing more and more groups, and I'm working with more and more groups where you're not on the board until 4 months after the AGM. There's a transition window where you come in and you shadow and you go to some training and you learn things and you go through all the bylaws. And the old board doesn't get to just quit after the AGM. And I think there's ways for us to invest in our governance and our boards to make that successful.
Yeah.
Related to that, Ruth McCambridge from Nonprofit Quarterly was in Edmonton. This was years ago, but one of the things she said that stuck with me is committees are so important for getting work done, but also if you think about committees as farm teams for your board, that's where you help get people up to speed, knowledge and skill wise, before they join the board, so they can be successful from day one. And that has stuck with me in the 6 years or more since she's been here, is wow, we really underutilize the potential of committees to help with getting work done and with training people and getting them ready for the board, recruiting to the board.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So Jen, my
David,
question for you, and thank
Okay,
you
David,
for the great session.
go easy on me, hey buddy.
So I'm wondering on your thoughts on, the decision-making framework and how much of a living document it is. Because as I was listening, there are parts where it's like, yeah, totally. And then there are other parts where you said something like, oh, I need to rethink something you said earlier. And so what I mean by that is, I think it's great to have a decision-making framework. And one of the comments, I think every organization has one, they just don't articulate it. So therefore it benefits some people and not others.
Oh, it's unspoken for sure. Yeah.
But every time you bring new people onto the board, your dynamic changes, your frameworks, your culture, your diversity changes. Is that part of, do you think, onboarding? Is that it's not just we're going to teach you our decision-making framework, but it's actually when is it the difference between we're teaching you our decision-making framework versus we're assessing our decision-making framework based against the current people who are making the decisions to make sure it works for them? Where is the difference in that, in your thoughts?
Good question. No, this is a really good question. So I have a couple of thoughts on that. One is that I do think it is, so I think there should be some basics in bylaws that you don't want to have change very easily, because of course bylaws you have to take to membership and go to an AGM, but I think it should be really high level. So I think it should be like, at least 3 of the decision-making principles or the board will have a decision-making framework that involves these 3 principles or something, like high level stuff that's hard to change, so that if someone comes up, if Robert shows up and wants to start taking over and having everything be Robert's rules and people need to stand to be, they can't do it because these principles in our bylaws require that we take an equitable approach, that inclusion is considered, inclusion and accessibility, whatever is considered and everything. So I think there's some really high level or fundamental stuff that should be in bylaws. That's not easy to change, obviously, though it is changeable. Everything else I think should be in policies. Like most policies, they should be reviewed on, it should be minimally reviewed on a regular basis. So I would say to most nonprofits, don't try and do all of your policies every 3 years. Do a chunk of policies in year 1, another chunk in year 2, another chunk in year 3, another chunk in year 4, and then go back to the beginning and review the first chunk again in year 5 or something. So I do think it should be reviewed at least that regularly. More to the point of your question though, I think it was, what about learning on the way? And what about if we increase diversity on the board and we need changes to that framework to better include and accommodate and learn from, evolve with what we're learning with those diverse perspectives and new perspectives on the board. And I think it is a-okay to discuss and review and maybe update the framework as new members are brought on. What I would say is that it's probably a conversation with new members. Here's what the framework is. Here's how it's intended. Do you have any questions? Do you see any gaps? Do you see any problems? Let's flag those and write those down. Maybe it's not something that changes as soon as someone shows up on the board, like, I have a better idea for how our decisions could be made. I want to see these changes to the framework. Maybe it's a conversation to start. It's a flag of here's things we need to evaluate about this framework. Let's practice with the framework as it exists now for the next 2 meetings. And part of the evaluate decision-making part of the framework I talked about, the 10th component, which should be happening, I would think, fairly regularly, like at the end of each meeting or quarterly or something. As a part of that, then you can make tweaks to that framework in your policy. So my short answer to your question is, it is a living document. I think it can be tweaked fairly regularly and fairly frequently. I think that the process for that should be part of the decision-making framework, because that's a decision, is changing the framework. So how do you move through the framework to change the framework? Does that help? Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
All right, I think we will close things up now. Thanks to everybody that hung in there right till now and being part of the whole session. Thank you again, Jen, for staying with us longer to take those questions. I think I always find these little conversations even after are just as valuable as the session themselves on information, a little more detail and some things. So thank you for agreeing to take the time to do that. Really appreciate that. And again, thank you. Even, David, look forward to your session next week. Appreciative policy making. I definitely will be tuned in at this time for that. Thanks again for your questions even today as well. And again, everybody for taking part in the session. So this is it, folks. I'm going to sign off now here. Jen, I'll probably connect with you right back at the end after we sign off here. But this is it for now for everybody. Take care. See you next week.
Thanks, everyone. Take care. Good to see you.